Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on popular democracy, party patronage, and presidential power in the age of Jackson. The core question is this: what kind of democracy expands the electorate while tightening exclusion and executive power at the same time? The core competency is to explain the emergence and characteristics of popular democracy. What kind of democracy expands the electorate while tightening exclusion and executive power at the same time? In the 1820s and 1830s, many states removed property requirements for white male voters. That change altered the scale of politics. Men who had once stood outside the formal electorate entered it in larger numbers. Campaign managers now had to organize county meetings, print handbills, circulate newspapers, and move candidates beyond courthouse elites and legislative caucuses. Public politics became louder, more regular, and more demanding. Voter turnout rose. Presidential elections became mass events. Campaign songs, banners, parades, partisan dinners, and newspaper endorsements pulled politics into ordinary life. The change was real, but it rested on a racial boundary. White male suffrage expanded while women, free black Americans in many places, enslaved people, and native peoples remained outside the electorate or faced tightening exclusion. The election of 1824 sharpened this shift. Andrew Jackson won the largest share of the popular vote and the largest number of electoral votes, but he did not win an electoral majority. The House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams after Henry Clay threw support to Adams. Jackson supporters denounced the result as a corrupt bargain. That charge carried force because more voters had begun to think national legitimacy should follow mass preference. A republic that widened white male voting made it harder to defend older brokered arrangements that looked remote from ordinary voters. Jackson's supporters built a durable grievance out of 1824 and used it in the campaign of 1828. By then, national politics had changed shape. Campaigning became organized, sustained, and partisan. Newspapers aligned openly with parties. Local committees coordinated turnout. Politics started to look like a permanent machine rather than an occasional contest among gentlemen. The shift in voting rules also changed how politicians spoke. Candidates appealed less to deference and more to resentment, honor, and identification. Jackson's image as a military hero from New Orleans changed events because it supplied a story of strength against distant elites. His enemies saw danger in that style. His followers saw representation. Once large numbers of white male voters entered politics, parties needed symbols that could move them quickly. Jacksonian democracy therefore grew through organization as much as through ideas. The ballot box counted, but so did the editor, the printer, the rally organizer, and the county-level party worker who kept names, loyalties, and local grievances in circulation. Before Jackson's rise, earlier party conflict had already shown Americans that organized politics could be national, but the scale of mobilization in the 1828 and 1832 elections was different. The older deferential order never disappeared completely, yet it no longer controlled the public square in the same way. States revised constitutions, legislatures and conventions adjusted voting qualifications, campaign newspapers proliferated. Improvements in transportation and printing helped campaign messages travel farther and faster. Turnpikes, post roads, and an expanding postal system carried papers, pamphlets, and speeches into villages and county seats. Politics became more regular because communication became more regular. The Democratic Party built itself inside that environment. Jackson's allies learned to connect local organization to national messaging. They relied on newspaper editors, county operatives, office holders, and mass meetings. State and local committees counted supporters, organized polling day turnout, and reinforced party identity between elections. The Whigs later answered with their own networks, but the early advantage belonged to the Democrats because they attached organization to a strong public narrative. The people had been denied their due in 1824, and Jackson would restore popular control. Another part of the old order also came under pressure. Many Americans distrusted concentrated financial power, especially when it appeared tied to federal authority. The Second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816, held federal deposits, regulated credit, and influenced the national money supply. Supporters argued that the bank stabilized commerce and restrained reckless lending by state banks. Critics saw it as an unelected center of privilege. This disagreement changed events because the market economy was expanding. Farmers, merchants, land buyers, and speculators all lived closer to credit decisions than before. A financial institution headquartered far from them could appear both necessary and threatening. The same period also exposed tensions over federal and state authority. Protective tariffs angered many Southerners, especially in South Carolina, where political leaders argued that federal tariff policy favored Northern manufacturers at Southern expense. The argument over nullification did not emerge from nowhere. It grew from earlier states' rights claims, sectional economic difference, and distrust of consolidated national power. Jackson entered office in a republic that was already straining over money, federal authority, and mass politics. His importance lies in how he turned those pressures into a stronger, more visible presidency. Jackson and his allies defended rotation in office as a democratic principle. They argued that government posts should not remain in the hands of a permanent office-holding class. Rotation, in that view, checked entrenched privilege and opened public service to ordinary citizens. In practice, the spoils system tied appointments to party loyalty. Postmasters, customs collectors, clerks, and other office holders could be removed and replaced with supporters. These offices sat at pressure points. Post offices sat inside daily communication networks. Customs houses handled revenue at ports. Local federal clerks carried the visible presence of national power. Replacing personnel after victory therefore strengthened the party machine at precisely the points where information and administration met. Martin Van Buren helped shape this party system. He believed disciplined party organization could manage sectional tension by channeling conflict into structured competition. Patronage was part of that structure. It rewarded loyalty, created expectations, and linked electoral success to administrative consequence. Critics charged corruption and incompetence, and those criticisms had substance. Yet the spoil system also revealed a new assumption. Winning an election entitled a party to staff government in ways that sustained its coalition. The line between democratic rotation and partisan control became difficult to separate. The bank war placed Jackson at the center of a constitutional and financial conflict. Nicholas Biddle, president of the Second Bank, sought an early recharter in 1832. Henry Clay supported the move, expecting Jackson either to sign a charter that angered anti-bank voters or to veto it and appear irresponsible. Jackson vetoed the bill. He cast the bank as an institution that favored the rich and powerful, including stockholders and commercial interests insulated from ordinary citizens. The veto message did more than reject a bank charter. It argued that the president could judge constitutionality and public justice independently rather than defer to Congress or the Supreme Court as the final interpreters of public necessity. After re-election, Jackson escalated the conflict by removing federal deposits from the bank and placing them in selected state banks, often called pet banks. Secretary of the Treasury Lewis McLean resisted. William J. Duane also refused. Jackson replaced officials until Roger B. Taney carried out the removal. That sequence is decisive because it shows presidential power operating through appointments and removals inside the executive branch. Deposits moved, state banks expanded lending, speculation intensified. Biddle responded by tightening credit. The conflict rippled outward into the broader economy. Farmers, merchants, and borrowers felt the consequences through loans, prices, and confidence. A fight over constitutional authority and democratic rhetoric became a fight over money on the ground. The nullification crisis exposed another edge of Jacksonian power. South Carolina, led intellectually by John C. Calhoun, declared the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void within the state. Calhoun argued that a state could judge the constitutionality of federal laws and block enforcement. Jackson rejected that claim. In his proclamation to the people of South Carolina, he defended the Union and denied that a single state could dissolve federal law at will. Congress passed a force bill authorizing enforcement, while Henry Clay helped broker a compromise tariff in 1833. Jackson thus appeared both as tribune of limited government democracy and as a forceful defender of federal supremacy. The contradiction was real. He attacked one national institution, the bank, while threatening coercion against a state resisting federal tariff law. His standard was not abstract consistency, it was political judgment about which powers served his vision of the Union and the people who counted within it. Jackson's 1832 veto message works as the central source because it reveals the language of democratic attack and executive enlargement in the same document. He condemned the bank as a structure tilted toward privilege. He described how the rich and powerful often bend the axe of government to selfish purposes. That line changed events because it converted a technical institution into a political enemy recognizable to mass voters. A chartered bank became part of a moral argument about favoritism, monopoly, and unequal influence. The message also broadened presidential claims. Earlier presidents had vetoed measures mainly on narrow constitutional grounds. Jackson used the veto as a public weapon. He claimed the authority to judge whether the bank served the constitutional order and the common good.
He did not wait for Congress to define the public interest for him. He did not treat the Supreme Court as the sole constitutional referee. The office of president, in this source, speaks as a direct interpreter of the nation. That shift shaped later practice. Once a president presents himself as the official who stands between the people and concentrated privilege, the veto becomes more than a defensive check. It becomes a leadership tool. Jackson's language invited citizens to understand national politics through a direct bond between popular voters and executive action. Congress still legislated, courts still ruled, and parties still competed, but the presidency claimed a new emotional and constitutional centrality. Jackson's wording also hides exclusions inside the word people. Jackson's rhetoric treated the nation as if its political body were unified. It was not. The same administration that attacked elite monopoly also enforced Indian removal, defended slavery where it already existed, and accepted the exclusion of women from formal politics. The message gains power by speaking in universal language while operating in a republic defined by race and gender hierarchy. That gap belongs in the reading of the document itself. The source is effective because it simplifies the nation into a public whose voice the president claims to protect. Placed next to patronage and nullification, the veto message becomes even sharper. If the president stands for the people, then replacing office holders can be defended as restoring democratic government. If the president speaks for the union, then force against nullifiers can be defended as preserving the constitutional order. Jackson's anti-bank language therefore cannot be isolated as mere financial policy. It belongs to a larger expansion of executive confidence inside a mass party republic. Jacksonian democracy left a durable mark on American political life. Mass white male participation became normal rather than exceptional. Turnout remained high. Parties became central mediating institutions. Campaigning turned into organized work rather than occasional elite persuasion. The president emerged as a more openly political national leader. The veto, patronage, and public appeals helped define the office in ways later presidents would inherit. The same period also hardened boundaries. The electorate widened for white men. Yet black Americans in many northern states faced discrimination or disfranchisement. Women remained outside the ballot, and native nations confronted removal. Democratic participation and racial domination did not move in separate stories. They moved together. That is one reason Jacksonian politics remains so significant. It demonstrates that wider participation alone does not settle the question of justice. A larger electorate can still support exclusion, seizure, and coercive power. Economic consequences followed the political ones. The destruction of the second bank helped destabilize the financial system. Easy credit and speculative lending expanded in some state banks. Land sales surged. The Specie Circular of 1836, issued late in Jackson's presidency, required payment for public lands in specie rather than paper notes. Combined with international credit contraction and domestic speculation, these developments fed conditions that contributed to the Panic of 1837 under Martin Van Buren. A democratic attack on privilege had become part of a chain of events that helped unsettle the economy. Jackson's fight with nullification also left a mixed inheritance. He denied that a state could unmake federal law, which strengthened unionist claims. Yet the doctrines sharpened by Calhoun did not disappear. They remained available for later defenders of slavery and secession. Jacksonian politics therefore widened popular energy while preserving future constitutional danger. The age can be described accurately only if these pieces remain together: expanded turnout, stronger parties, patronage staffing, an enlarged veto, anti-bank populism, coercive unionism, and exclusion by race and gender. Remove one piece and the picture distorts. The record shows a democracy that grew more participatory for many white men while becoming more disciplined by party machinery and more forceful through the presidency. Mass politics widened participation for many white men while sharpening exclusion, patronage discipline, and executive force. The harder judgment is whether that growth should be remembered mainly as democratization or as a redistribution of power within firm racial and gender boundaries. The age expanded the electorate without resolving what democracy owed beyond it.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.